So in our last lesson, I hinted at how we measure development. I talked a little bit about less developed countries and more developed countries, and talking about how there are more people working in the primary sector in less developed countries, but in more developed countries, there's very few people working in the primary sector, and vice versa. In more developed countries, there's more people working in the tertiary sector, and in less developed countries, there's fewer people working in the tertiary sector. So that's an indication that we measure development. And today we're going to talk about how we measure development. So here's our objective: describe social and economic measures of development. Measures of economic and development include, and then we're going to go into what they are. So we're focusing only on economic measures of development in this lesson. The social measures of development we will work on in our next lesson. So here's the definition for development: a specific state of growth or advancement. And different parts of the world are developed differently, and there's a lot of different indicators that make them look different. But for the most part, more developed countries have more industrialization, they have more machines doing more of the work, and people are physically doing less of the work. People are able to, in more developed countries, to use their brain power for work, and are using less their physical body to do their work. And so countries do change over time, but even within a country, you will have different variations. So I want you to take a look at the different maps here. So these maps show there's a connection between poverty and development. So countries that are very poor are considered less developed, and countries that are very rich are considered more developed. Now, I guess you could have a poor country with a lot of factories, but for the most part, that's only part of the equation. So development is more than just the factories. It's also how are the people living within the country. So you could have a country like China with a lot of factories, but there's parts of China that aren't very developed, and we're going to look at that right here with these maps. So since I mentioned China, let's go ahead and look at China. So China has 3 different colors. So it is broken down into sub-states. So remember, a country is a state. I know it's confusing, but let's just put it in our brain right now. A country is a state. And so all of these different divisions within China are considered sub-state. And I think China actually calls them provinces. I don't think they call them states. Yeah, oh, there it is in the title. They're provinces. So those are sub-state divisions. And you can see in the blue, those are the richest parts of China. But in the orange, actually the largest geographical land mass in China, or land portion of China, is orange. And that's where it's less developed, where it's poor, and people in this area tend to work more in the primary sector. There tend to be a lot of farmers in this area. And as you move more west, particularly, or east, yes, east, opposite of where we are in California, when you move east onto the East Coast, that is where you have more people working in the tertiary sector and the secondary sector. And then you also have higher per capita income. So per capita just means per person. You're going to hear that a lot in this development unit. So let's continue by looking at the state of Ohio. So Ohio is on the top left. And you can see that Ohio has a lot of inequality. There's some counties in Ohio that are more wealthy than other counties in Ohio. And there's a fairly large cluster of red counties. So those are the poorest counties in Ohio. And so this is a local scale of analysis because we're looking at the county level. Now let's look at Mexico. Mexico also has a great variation in poverty rates within the country. And Mexico looks like it's broken down into regional analysis. It's divided between states, so I don't know that I would say sub-state, but more regional analysis. And then we have the United States broken down into sub-state. So we have some states with much higher poverty levels than others. And then we have our world map with regions being defined differently. So for the most part, what this map is showing is how the southern hemisphere tends to be poor and the northern hemisphere tends to be richer, with the exception of Australia, which is in the box in the bottom right. So for the most part, this is a regional map showing that that's something that you really should take away. The northern hemisphere tends to be the richer part of the world, with the exception of Australia, which is considered a rich country, an MDC, and then the southern half of the world being LDCs. Now, this doesn't perfectly coincide with the equator. So the equator actually runs right in the middle of, I'm going to see if I can show you. Well, let's see. Let's pick a color. Yellow will work. Okay, so here's Brazil. Here's Brazil. See where I just highlighted Latin America? There's Brazil. So here's the equator right here. So it's not like the equator's the dividing line. There's actually some other mystical dividing line between north and south. So up here, it's not straight, doesn't go with any longitude, latitude lines. It is a line all of its own. So the words on the left are the ones we're focusing on. How can we measure a country's development? So these are the things we look at. These are the things we're going to be explaining, the ones on the left. Gross domestic product, gross national product, and gross national income. So in human geography and in economics, gross does not mean disgusting. Gross means total. So it means total domestic product, total national product, and total national income. Then we're going to be looking at sectoral sector of the economy, which is informal and formal. So I'll explain that to you. It sounds kind of funky, but basically we have people who report their income and people who don't. And then we have income distribution. And then we're going to learn about the Gini coefficient and what that's about, and then the use of fossil fuels and renewable energy. And so everything on the right, the social aspects, that's what we're going to look at the next lesson that we do on this. So those are also very important in measuring development, but that's for next time. Okay, so our economic indicators are usually described in per capita, which is per person. And the reason that we do this per person, obviously, if a country like India that has, or China has a really high population, and if you take their their gross domestic product, and it looks like it's really huge, but then when you divide it by the number of people in the country, it becomes much smaller. So that's why we always consider the per person, because really that's more of an indicator on what people's everyday average lives look like. So the first one that we look at is the gross domestic product. And so this is the total value of officially recorded goods and services by citizens and corporations within a country's borders in a given year. So it's all the goods and services, everything that is made and sold and happening within this country. Okay, then we have the gross national product, which is the total value of goods and services by the citizens and corporations of a country, as well as foreign investments in a given year. So we are adding all of the things produced domestically and international, plus the services, and that makes up the gross national product. So what that means is we have an American company that has a factory overseas. Well, that would include those things that American company is making in that factory overseas, because we own, or I shouldn't say we, because we don't own it, but the American corporation owns all of the product that is produced in that factory, even though the people who are employed by the factory may be from another country like Mexico or China. Okay, and then the last one is the gross national income. And this one is considered the most accurate measure of wealth, although it is not the most quoted measure of wealth. The most quoted measure you're going to see is GDP. Always, everybody talks about GDP. So it accounts for the impacts of trade as well. So it considers your GDP plus imports minus exports. Or, I'm sorry, exports minus imports. So what that is the number. So let's say the United States exports, this is just an example, this is not a reality. The United States exports 500 computers to other countries. But we import, and that may look good on paper, like, oh, look, we're making all this money off of computers. But then let's say we import 10,000. So that will figure in that deficit between our exports and our imports. So our GNI per capita, if you look at the world, we're looking at $20,000 per person and above. So in the United States, we're clearly above that. And then you can see in dark green all of the countries around the world that are above that. And then you may look at China and you're like, hey, but you just talked about imports and exports, and they're like exporting tons of stuff, and we're importing all their stuff. So how can they be light green and we're dark green? Well, it's because of the great amount of income that we have coming in from other things besides producing products in factories that we export. So we still have a great amount of wealth coming in. It doesn't have to be made through like factories. For example, we export a ton of our media products all over the world. So there are things that we export that aren't necessarily made in factories that may be made. We export a lot of intellectual property. So we do a lot of thinking in the United States, and then we export what we think about to other parts of the world. For example, iPhones and all Apple products are designed in California, even though they're assembled in China. But you know what? China actually doesn't make most of the Apple products. The parts of the products are actually made in Japan and Germany. So only the assembly portion actually, happens in China. So it's made all over the world. But anyway, so ideas can be exports as well. But the green countries are the ones with the highest GNI, but it's $20,000. So we're not talking about a ton of money. So you may look at some of the countries here and you may be thinking, oh, well, I don't think of that as a rich country. And well, you know, it's not really. The other thing it's not accounting for is inequality. So if you have a few really, really, really wealthy people in a country, it can make your GNI skewed. So that is going to be an issue as well. Okay, so we saw this chart before where we looked at MDCs and LDCs, and we looked at how in MDCs in 1820 we had, I need one of my markers here. What color? I'm going to do black. So in 1820 we had a lot of people in MDCs, so countries like the United States, or, you know, in 1820, I don't know if it was really all that more developed, but let's go with England. So in 1820, we had a lot of people in England working in the primary sector, but that pretty much declined by year 2000. So that declines. But then if you look at an LDC, so I'm just going to use, for example, I'm just going to say the Philippines. In 1820, a lot of people were working in the primary sector, and if you go to today, it's less, but we still have a lot of people working in the primary sector. Okay, so that's what this one is about. And the reason is just because as countries become more developed, they become more industrialized and they have more machines. And so the machines do most of the labor as opposed to people having to get out there and doing everything physically themselves. So just imagine somebody having a backhoe to do digging as opposed to having a shovel to do digging, and how much digging can you get done with a shovel versus a backhoe. So a backhoe is one of those tractors with the big scoop. So you got that big scoop, you can get a lot of digging done very quickly. So tractors make all the difference in this. That's a great tool. There's a lot of other ones, but that one's a really good one as well. Okay, so we have two countries in comparison. We have the United States, and then we have India. So the three colors we have are the royal blue is agriculture, the dark blue to black is industry, and the gray is services. So if you look at the United States, in 2009, we had about 20% of the people working in industry. So that we're talking about like, manufacturing where they're putting things together and they're creating a product. And then you have that tiny sliver, you can't even see it, but that's agriculture because we have about 2% of the people working in agriculture. And then you go down to 2013, it's, down to 16% working in industry, and then you still can't see the agricultural line. It's so small. So we have 70 to 80% of the people working in services. And as we talked about last time, these services range. There's all kinds of services from working at Target to being a brain surgeon. It has nothing to do with income. Okay, and then you look at India. So India has a ton of people working in agriculture. So there's a little bit of shift. We have 2010, 51%, 2012, 47%, and then up a little again in 2013 at 49%. So why? Why so many people working in agriculture? Because they just really love food in India? Well, maybe, but that's not why. That's not why they're working in agriculture. They're working in agriculture because they don't have the machinery that we have here. So here, our farms are huge, huge swaths of land, many hectares of land. We have huge machines that work the land, and very few people who actually work in the farm industry. And then, whereas in India, you're going to have smaller plots of land, more people working it, and less machinery. You probably have a lot of oxen involved and things like that. You'll have more animals involved. That will be your advancement, is getting the animals involved. And then if you look at the industry, they actually have about the same amount or a little more industry. So the manufacturing is bigger than the United States because they are kind of a country in transition. They're transitioning from being less developed to more developed. Some parts of India are becoming very developed. And then if you look at the tertiary sector, the service sector, we have less than 30% of the people working in the tertiary sector. Okay, so we have sectors of the economy, and we have two different types of sectors. We have formal sector and informal sector. So formal sector is most of the business that happens within a country. And in a developed country, the vast majority of the business is formal. But it also, in a more developed country, it still has informal sectors. So informal sector is going to be illegal trade like the drug trade or prostitution. Other things that aren't necessarily illegal, but it's often under the table would be like babysitting. If you guys ever get hired to babysit, you don't report that on your taxes. You don't even pay taxes. You're 14. So, or if your mom pays you to, clean the house or something like that, or even if you have a cleaning lady that comes in and she says, hey, pay me cash and I'll give you a discount. Why is that? Because she's not reporting it in her taxes. Same thing, like you get workers that do things. For example, I just had a chimney sweep come, and yes, there are still people who do that. And he put a new part in my chimney for me and I paid him cash. He's like, all right. He's all excited. Well, why is he excited? Because he's not going to report it. He didn't say that to me, but I knew why. It's because he's not going to report it. So anything that's informal like that does not show up in GDP or GNI. and it is under the table. And then your less developed countries will have a larger informal economy. You think about informal economy, this is just how the world started with like trade. Like, like I raise chickens and you raise corn. Hey, let's trade. That's the way it used to be. Well, in a less developed country, they're still doing more of that, or they're doing more trade, or they're just doing more things in cash and it's not getting reported. In India, I don't know if it's still true, but I've heard a couple places that they really don't use credit cards that much. It's mostly a cash industry. That doesn't mean that everything, like it's not getting reported, but it does increase the likelihood that things won't get reported if it's all cash. Okay, we're going to look at income distribution and the Gini coefficient. So, Gini coefficient is measuring the equality within a country, like how equal are things within a country. So, we looked at a couple of maps in an earlier slide. We looked at the one of China and how through its different regions, some of its provinces are much more wealthy than other provinces. And then we also looked at a map of Ohio. And by the way, California is the same way. But we looked at a map of Ohio and how some parts of Ohio are much poorer and then other parts are wealthier. So, and even within a city, you're going to have like neighborhoods that are more expensive, like the houses are more expensive. You're going to have inequality everywhere. But then we're looking at the national or state level where we have countries that are more unequal than others. And generally, the general rule is the less developed a country is, the more unequal it is. So, in a less developed country, you're going to have a few people who are holding all the wealth. And those less developed countries, a lot of them are really corrupt. And there's a few people who get power through corrupt means, and they just find ways to take all the money. And then we have countries that are more equal, where, there's not as big a gap from the richest people and the poorest people. So if you look on this map here, the countries that are they're in dark blue, that are known to be the most equal. The Scandinavian countries are the most equal. So actually, in this one, we have Ukraine at the top, which is actually Eastern European, and so is Slovenia. Norway is Scandinavian. So we have Eastern European countries being at the top, which are near Scandinavia. And then the most unequal countries, all of them being in Africa, except for Haiti. Haiti is kind of near-ish Florida. So it's one of those islands down there by Cuba and Florida. So if you know where Florida is, then you should kind of have the idea of where Haiti is. And those countries are really unequal. But there's another thing I want you to look at with this map. Some of the things you think about the United States, like things are really great here, right? And people have it really great. Well, we're actually pretty unequal. We're considered the most unequal developed country. And why is that? Because the way our country is set up, we allow for a great accumulation of wealth into the hands of very few people. Um, and you may have heard this before, that like the top 100 people hold more wealth than the bottom 50%, or even like I've even heard like the bottom, maybe a bigger number, like the top 1,000 people hold more than the bottom 90%. Like basically, like there's some really rich people in the United States. They are so rich, and our laws are set up to really protect them and protect their wealth. You may have heard in the news just recently that when they've looked at the president's past tax records, that he hasn't paid a lot of taxes. And you may have heard that like Jeff Bezos and Amazon doesn't pay a lot of taxes. Like, how does that make any sense? Well, that's the way our tax codes are set up, to protect the wealthiest people. Basically, they're given a lot of opportunities to write stuff off. And that's opportunities that most average people in the United States just don't have. And then other countries that are more equal, well, they don't have those same opportunities for earning super high income. and they also don't allow for those loopholes that we allow for the wealthiest people in our country. Okay, another marker for more developed countries. We consume a lot of energy. Okay, we use a lot of fossil fuels. That means we're using a lot of electricity. We're using a lot of gasoline for our cars, our airplanes. We're definitely using a lot of fossil fuels. And so if you look at all of the red countries, those are the ones that are using the most. So definitely the United States. And then Saudi Arabia, one of the reasons they would be using a lot of fossil fuel, a couple reasons. One reason is they produce it, so it's really cheap for them. The other reason is it's really hot there, so they're going to want to turn on a lot of air conditioning. Um, and then renewable energies are catching on. They're becoming more popular. And in more developed countries, nuclear energy is becoming popular in most places. You don't like, we think about nuclear energy as like nuclear bombs. And yes, you can create nuclear bombs, but you also can create electricity with nuclear energy. And it's much cleaner than using fossil fuels for electricity. The downside is obviously you can have explosions with nuclear energy. So back in the 70s and 80s, nuclear energy was really catching on because it was a really inexpensive energy. It was a really clean energy. And then we had quite a few like explosions, problems. And so it became less popular, but it's still in existence in the United States and other developing or other developed countries. And then in the developing countries, or also known as LDCs or less developing countries, hydroelectric is becoming more popular. So hydroelectric is electricity produced by water energy. So we're not doing that as much here. We're doing a lot of solar energy in the United States, but hydroelectricity is not really the way we're going. Okay, try to answer the question without looking back. As many as you can come up with. Measures of economic development include. So, what do they include? Try to remember. And then, after you've remembered, then go back into the slides and see what you missed.